Hello everybody, my name is Alejandro Sánchez Cabrera. I'm a PhD candidate at the University of Salamanca, and today I will be presenting my study on the disruption of the post-traumatic narrative and the celebration of female voices in Miriam Gurba's 2017 memoir, Mean. This research project is being carried out within the PhD program in Advanced English Studies at the University of Salamanca, and it is being funded and supported by both the University of Salamanca and Banco Santander. Thank you to everyone that's listening and to the organizing committee. And I would like to say that I don't have my camera on because it's not working. Okay. I would like to start by giving a trigger warning because this presentation contains explicit information and sensitive content. Okay. The present study examines the universal nature of violence against women and the culture that normalizes this violence as portrayed by Miriam Gurba in Mean. The autobiographical narrative excavates two women's stories and their exposure to gendered violence within this culture. The writer probes into the multifaceted forms of violence, namely direct, systemic, and symbolic, and how they are reproduced in the everyday lives of women. She explores gender as the trigger to power imbalances and denounces rape as the ultimate representation of excess of power exercised by men. Gurba presents this three-stage exploration through the disruption of the narrative, a disruption that is achieved through instances of violence and the probing into of her post-traumatic mind, shedding light on the consequences of being, first of all, sexually assaulted, also institutionally silenced, and forced to experience survivor guilt. She deliberately disrupts the chronological linearity of the memoir with instances of violence with a double purpose in mind. On the one hand, to expose the reader to the patriarchal reality women are forced to live on a daily basis, and on the other hand, to show the fragmented nature of post-traumatic memory and the subsequent disrupted narrative, further propounding that violence against women is something that is universal. The writer disrupts the narrative of her memoir with violence and images of cruelty, as she narrates her own account of survival after being sexually assaulted. However, her traumatic experience and the post-traumatic account of her memories are represented in a way that her own story is also intertwined with that of Sofia Torres, who is a woman who was also assaulted and brutally murdered by the same man who assaulted Gurba. Through the disruption of her linear narrative, Min excavates two women's personal her stories and a history of gendered violence against women, as she unveils how different forms of violence against women are manifested and perpetuated. To begin with, direct forms of violence are usually easily identified, since they are performed through physical interpersonal acts. However, as Cecilia Mengiber points out, taken individually, other gender forms of violence may be difficult to identify or differentiate on a daily basis because they are defined in terms of general concepts. Yet, if we take them as a whole, it'll allow us to unveil a broader interconnected context of violence that shapes the lives of women. Gurba does an excellent job at presenting direct violence as more brutally conspicuous. Nonetheless, she deliberately exposes women's power inequalities through the manifestation of other gendered forms of violence in the daily life of women. The opening of the autobiography presents the first instance of direct violence, and it is precisely this opening that first shocks the reader. Gurba opens the memoir presenting an extreme moment of brutality that leads to Sofia's assault and assassination without providing a previous context. Here, I don't know if you can read it, but the writer encourages the reader to take part in the vivid reconstruction of the events. She tells us to become that night, to become that part, and thus she starts to guide us, the readers, through a journey where violence is explicitly narrated. In this respect, Min constitutes a refusal to let the reader be silent or passive throughout the narration. Rather, the reader becomes an active agent and a witness. The writer manages to accomplish this by exposing the reader to violence and its public and cruel outcome as she narrates how an unknown man creeps up behind Sophia, hits her in the head, raises his weapon, takes another swing, and whacks her again. He, and I quote, kicks her, flips onto her back, slides a knife onto his pocket, straddles her waist, presses his blade to her, and eventually feeds himself into her. End of quote. End of quote. By unfolding such a brutal act of sexual violence, Gurba forces the reader to recreate this scenario and witness the reality and nature of violence many women are forced to experience since, as scholar Victoria Adams points out, and I quote, it is difficult to find a woman anywhere in the world who does not know violence, end of quote. Gurba takes this state further and claims that probably, as we speak, somewhere on this planet, a man is touching a woman to death. After this, Gurba starts the account of her own memories and follows a chronological order. She narrates how she grew up and the different experiences she lived through. However, violence continues to disrupt her life and memories. She recounts how she was also subject to sexual violence even during her childhood. She describes how she, while studying seventh grade, was molested by a classmate. As she continues her narration, it is perceptible that the pervasiveness of acts of direct violence continues to disrupt the narration as she becomes an adult, until it culminates with Gurba's report of her sexual assault and rape, an event that triggers her PTSD and that makes her realize, and I quote, just how evil the ordinary guy is, end of quote, concluding that, and I quote, getting raped is possible and rapists lurk everywhere, even in impossible places, end of quote. So even though the instances of gender-based acts of interpersonal violence examined serve as a way of depicting the cruelty and brutality of direct violence, they fail to define its complex nature as a complex process and not merely as a physical event. But there is more beyond physical damage. To begin with, systemic forms of violence can be understood as those institutional practices that promote harm among groups of people. This manifestation of violence is essentially expressed by how institutions react and respond to direct acts of violence. Judith Herman points out that after a traumatic event, the survivor needs the help of other people to acknowledge the fact that this event happened. However, the writer, Gurba, was not able to find that help. She encountered a notorious lack of action when the nurse who attended her after the assault recommended her to stay silent and I quote, get over it, because these kinds of things happened, end of quote. Thus, after seeking help and being rejected, Gurba finds herself trapped in a reality where a patriarchal system, which is also implemented by women, refuses to let survivors speak up, perpetuating the normalization and subsequent institutional acceptance of this excess of power. Because, as Bourdieu and Wakan highlight, and I quote, the male order is so deeply grounded as to need no justification, end of quote. Moreover, days after testifying before a detective, Gurba received a call from a man who was the district attorney, and he needed to corroborate her testimony. He asked several questions about the assault and concluded that, indeed, that's exactly what Gurba told the detective. This behavior unveils how unsafe the law can be for women because, in the words of Judith Butler, before the law, women need to be reliable narrators, and their reliability, acceptability, and correct intelligibility when narrating is much more valued than the testimony itself. Through these accounts, Gurba unveils gender as the trigger to deep power disparities between men and women. Not only is she presenting violence as a detrimental element that interrupts narratives, but she's also asserting that the whole process of violence and its inherent forms constitute the destructions of life. This practice of destruction becomes so socially normalized that it leads to the dehumanization of the figure of the woman. In fact, Susan Bryson indicates that, and I quote, the disintegration of the self experienced by victims of violence challenges our notions of personal identity, end of quote. Gurba, in this respect, reveals that after the assault, and I quote, everything became new, end of quote, and further states that rape breaks everything into bits and pieces, concluding that being attacked made her break up with her own body. Thus, she claims that suffering and pain become a part of the life of women who experience violence, exposing them to a process of, as Sarah Ahmed would say, alienation. This alienation constitutes the depersonalization of the self. She further shares her idea that God is like rape, because sexual violence is everywhere and has an omnipresent nature. Um, Moving on, John Lawrence's definition of violence encompasses the entire range of actions that result in serious injury, including, among others, psychological impairment. In this sense, as I stated before, the assault Gurva suffered had an enormous impact on her life as it triggered her post-traumatic stress syndrome, leading to and I quote, chaos of memories and a post-traumatic omnipresence that crystallizes in her being constantly haunted by the memory of the assaulter. Sorry. However, I would like to explore here the other side of this impairment, the survivor guilt Gurba experiences after discovering Sophia's murder and the ensuing complicated process of acceptance and conciliation with her ghost. Our first encounter with Sophia's ghost comes after the first instance of dire violence and the narration of Sophia's assassination. What we first know after this is that, and I quote, Sophia is always with the writer. She haunts her, end of quote. Then Gurba states that guilt is a ghost and further claims that some ghosts use us, believing that she should feel guilty about being alive. This is interesting to point out since, at first glance, Gurba denotes a sense of rejection and claims to be used by her ghost. This ghost then becomes a manifestation of guilt, providing another disruption on the narration. However, as Judith Herman claims in another context, guilt may be understood as an attempt to draw some lesson from disaster and to reacquire power and control. In this sense, Gurba guides the reader through a complicated journey she herself experiences, and as her story juxtaposes with Sophia's, Gurba develops a stronger bond that concludes with a final conciliation and acceptance of her ghost. This journey consists in rehumanizing Sophia's persona by telling her story and denouncing the injustice she lived. As we can see here, when she literally reconstructs the figure of Sophia with some court documents. Gurva eventually overcomes her initial rejection of the ghost and addresses Sophia directly to assure her that she will keep a record of both women's stories. Gurva's final resolution is that, and I quote, it is okay for ghosts to exist through me, it has to be, end of quote. This further emphasizes that she is not the only protagonist of her narrative and provides a new meaning to the story. Mean, it's not only men, it is also a story of sorority, the story of Sophia, of female art, female writing, and of all the women who suffered, were silenced, and dismissed. So, this presentation has attempted to demonstrate how Miriam Gurba intertwines her personal story with Sofia Torres' story and connect both women's exposure to violence within a culture that perpetuates and normalizes different forms of violence against women. Gurba intentionally disrupts the chronological progression within her memoir through the incorporation of instances of violence serving a dual purpose: to illuminate the reader to the pervasive patriarchal constructs that women confront in their daily lives, and secondly, to illustrate the fragmented nature inherent in post-traumatic memory and the ensuing disjointed narrative. Furthermore, Gurba presents rape as the ultimate figure of power exercised by men and propounds gender as the trigger to power imbalances between men and women, further indicating that violence against women is universal. Eventually, Min constitutes a political statement and an invitation to reconsider the interconnected oppression women face and consequently reappraise violence as a societal issue. Thus, the writer evaluates the universal suffering women experience and aligns herself with female figures and ghosts in order to give voice to the silenced and present a her story of sorority, self-consciousness, and conciliation. Thank you very much. These are my works cited, and I will be really happy to answer to any question or comment you may have. Thank you.